everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin, and on this channel I upload all sorts of videos relating to true crime, education and psychology related topics. And welcome back to another instalment of my true crime week. So if you haven't already seen all of the other uploads that I've put up this week, I have been uploading a different true crime video every single day of this week from Sunday to Sunday. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, turn your notifications on so you can see every upload that I post, and I hope you're looking forward to the rest of the week's content. So for today's video, we're going to be discussing the disappearance case of a 10-year-old girl named Beverly Rose Potts, and it really is a huge mystery. Ever since it occurred, it's been one of the sort of widely known missing child cases in its area, and it remains unsolved to this day. So we're going to be going over all of the details of the case today, but before we get started, I'm just going to zoom through my usual disclaimer that I like to include at the start of all my videos, just letting you guys know that I'm not claiming to be an expert in this case or any of the other cases that I cover over on my channel. I'm simply relaying the information I'm able to find myself through research of certain sources on the internet, and because only certain sources are accessible to me, it means I may get things wrong, leave things out or mispronounce things, and I apologise if I do any of those things. I'm not trying to cause anyone any harm or an injustice. I'm simply working with the information that I have available to me. So with all that being said, let's just get started discussing the case of Beverly Rose Potts. Beverly Rose Potts was born on April the 15th in the year of 1941, meaning that she would be turning 80 years old this year. On the Doe Network page dedicated to Beverly, she is listed as an endangered missing child since she was last seen in August of 1951 when she was just 10 years old. Beverly Potts had been born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, and by the time that she was 10, she had this bright blonde hair and bright blue eyes. She was referred to as being a quiet girl, often deemed as shy by those she met, but she had this huge love of the arts. At the time of her disappearance, she had been living with her mother and father, so Robert and Elizabeth Potts, and her older sister, Anita, who was 22 years old at the time. Their family home was located on Linnet Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio, and her disappearance had occurred less than a mile away from the street that she lived on. Because of this fact, her disappearance was widely known and shared. It struck a chord with so many people and invoked this huge sense of fear for their own children, the fact that this 10-year-old could go missing without a trace so close to her own home. And I'll insert a photo of the last photo ever taken of Beverly Potts just 5 days before her disappearance, where she was showing off her new haircut. On the 24th of August in the year of 1951, 10-year-old Beverly and her neighbour Patsy Swing had headed out for an exciting day together. The two friends had asked for their parents' permission to attend a show wagon that was taking place in Halloran Park that evening. And the show wagon was essentially this big public event that was directed at children, and it occurred every year in the summertime. So it featured a bunch of different performances for the children to watch and enjoy, while their parents could sort of keep an eye on them in this open park area. Halloran Park had been located less than a quarter of a mile away from where Beverly and Patsy lived, and even though it was so close to their homes, the girls' family usually didn't like the idea of them being out at the park after dark, and this was because of a couple different reasons. So firstly, the park was surrounded by these great big trees along the edge, so in the daytime obviously it caused no issues, but it meant that at night all of the light coming from the street lamps surrounding the park were often blocked towards the centre of the park, so that if you were in the park you couldn't really be seen from the outside streets, and it just made it very, very dark. And as well as this, it had become a rather popular location for vagrants and drifters to spend their evenings. And so because of these facts, the parents of local children, not just these two girls, but all of the local children in the area, had a shared preference for their children not being out in Halloran Park after dark. However, on this day, with the show wagon taking place, both Beverly and Patsy's parents had agreed to let the pair go. And because it was so close to home and it was a particularly busy event, they'd given their permission for the pair to visit the show wagon alone. It was at around 7 p.m. that night that the two girls had initially left home on their bicycles to head in the direction of Halloran Park. But around an hour later, to their parents' surprise, the pair had already appeared back home. As it would turn out, the girls had decided to head back home to drop off their bikes, since it was becoming increasingly difficult for them to move their way through the big crowds at the show wagon, towing their bikes along beside them. After dropping off their bikes at home, they headed back to the park on foot and had arrived at the show for around 8:30 p.m. It's believed that at around 8:45 p.m, Patsy had suggested that the pair start to head back home again, since they had previously already been at the show for around an hour, and she had promised her parents that she would be back home before it was completely dark out. However, Beverly had responded to Patsy by telling her that she'd been given permission by her parents to stay out until the end of the show, which was scheduled to end just after 9 p.m. And Patsy decided to head back home alone to make sure that she was following her parents' orders, meaning that Beverly was left at the busy show on her own. However, like I said before, this may have not previously been considered sort of a big concern at the time, since it had been a particularly busy event, mainly filled with children and their families, all local residents from around the same area. According to Patsy, the last time that she had seen Beverly was standing watching a performance on stage, and she said that she remembered seeing Beverly stood in front of a small, plump woman who had placed her hand on Beverly's shoulder, and it was believed that this particular woman she was seen standing in front of had had a child of her own in the show, hence why she was attending the show wagon. At around 9:30 p.m, the show had officially ended, and all of the families who'd stayed to watch the final performance had started filing away from the park, heading in different directions towards their homes. It's known that a 13-year-old local boy who knew Beverly POTTS had spotted her walking away from the performance around this time, as he specifically remembered seeing her from a distance and having recognised her because of her unique duck-like walk, as he sort of coined as he considered her to have. And this simply meant that she had this unusual gait when she was walking that made it seem like her feet were sort of pointed slightly outwards. According to this boy, he had seen her walking in a northeasterly direction, at which point she would have been around 150 yards away from the corner of the street that her home was on. The direction in which she was walking had suggested that she had taken the quickest route back to her home, which would have taken her to the corner of West 117th Street and Linnet Avenue, which is obviously where her house was. But despite being so close to her home, Beverly POTTS never made it home that night. When 10 p.m. came and went with no sign of their daughter, Beverly's parents had set out in search of the surrounding areas in the hopes that they would find her daughter somewhere, lingering with a friend, having not realised how late it had gotten, and they continued searching for an hour, including any routes that she could have taken from the park to get home, but still no sign of her. And so they called the police to notify them that their 10-year-old daughter was missing. Authorities quickly set out to gather as much information as possible from those who had been attendants at the show wagon that evening, in hopes that someone could aid them in their search for the young girl. In addition to the statement provided by the young boy who'd seen Beverly walking in the distance, there had been a select few other sightings believed to have been of Beverly. A few witnesses had told the authorities that they had seen a young girl matching the description of Beverly speaking to two young men sat inside a battered black 1937 Dodge Coupe. And according to these eyewitnesses, they had seen this car idling on West 117th Street, which again was the route that Beverly had believed to have walked in order to get home. And these witnesses had all placed this sighting at being somewhere between 8:30 p.m. and 9:30 p.m, which would potentially match up with the believed timeline of her heading in that direction following the end of the show at around 9:30. But none of these witnesses had seen Beverly getting into the car with the men, nor did any of them see the men getting out of the vehicle in the direction of Beverly. As I'm sure you can imagine, the search for Beverly had been a particularly large-scale one, so many people were in complete disbelief that something sinister could have happened to the young girl so close to her own home, and they maintained the belief that there must be some reasonable explanation for her whereabouts. But sadly, despite the continuous search for Beverly, there remained no sign of her. Just days after her disappearance, authorities had even set out knocking on the doors of residents in the neighbouring areas, just in hopes of someone having seen her for some strange reason in another neighbourhood. They'd set up a stop and search for vehicles who were deemed as being potentially suspicious passing through the area, and they'd even deployed a plane to search over train lines so that they can search from a higher angle, meaning that they could look through any of the open railway cars potentially transporting the missing girl. And in the weeks following the disappearance of Beverly, more and more tips were called in to the tip line set up by the authorities, meaning that they had this constant stream of tips to search. And the majority of these tips had appeared to have been placed by just concerned residents from the local area who believed that they may have witnessed something or someone suspicious that could be linked to the disappearance. But sadly, despite following all of the potential avenues of investigation, there were no solid leads for them to follow. And the media coverage following Beverly's disappearance was constant and extensive, as the public were actively fighting for this young girl to be returned to her family. So in terms of suspects, it's known that the authorities had considered each of her family members, as it can be a common occurrence for a family member to potentially be involved in the disappearance of a young child. And each of Beverly's family members had been adamant that her home life had been extremely happy, there had been no turmoil or worry of any kind in any area of her life. They had maintained the belief that she was an extremely happy young girl who would also have no reason to choose to run away from home, especially in the way in which she disappeared. And the main focus of the authorities' interest had been these two men that were allegedly seen talking to a young girl believed to be Beverly following the end of the show wagon. As I said in the beginning, Beverly was a particularly shy young girl to everyone that she met, but according to her family, she was particularly shy towards men that she didn't know and strangers in general, really. And so because of this fact, it was a widely considered theory that if these sightings had in fact been Beverly and she had been talking to these young men inside this car, then possibly it had been someone that she'd known. Aside from the two men in the car, it was also similarly considered that she could have been invited into a car or a house on her way home from the show wagon by someone that she'd known. It was known that Beverly had previously had a lot of experience babysitting in the neighbourhood that she lived in, and she was well known for her good behaviour in doing so despite her being so young. It was theorised that maybe someone that she was familiar with had offered her a babysitting job if she had helped them with something or done something for them, and it seemed as though the authorities were generally operating on the belief that she had been abducted by someone who lived either on her route home from the park that evening or in the surrounding neighbourhood, meaning that they were familiar with her and her whereabouts. A search of a property on Linnet Avenue was carried out in 1973, so a few years later, with authorities operating on the belief that this location could have been an area in which she may have been kidnapped or possibly murdered at the time of her disappearance. I believe by that point that they had searched this property, it had since been converted into a business of some kind, but the basement of the property was searched and this was the focus. Sadly, there remained no sign of Beverly Potts, and there remained no indication of what had happened to her or who could have been involved. And aside from this, there had been a few named individuals over the years that were considered as possibly having some connection to her disappearance. A man named Harvey Lee Rush had confessed to some Californian police officers in 1955 that he had killed Beverly Potts some years prior. This man had been a drifter who had been originally from Cleveland, and he claimed that he had lured Beverly to a nearby bridge with the promise of some candy, and the suspicion of this man had begun to weaken when he told authorities that he'd actually killed the girl in 1952, which would have been a year after she disappeared. So either he'd hidden her somewhere after allegedly luring her to the bridge on the night that she disappeared, or he had been lying about the entire confession. He then received word that he was being extradited to Cleveland, and in response, he recanted his entire confession. And the only reason he gave for lying about this confession was so that he could be transported back to his hometown. 2 months after Beverly's disappearance, an unidentified man had called her family at their home and claimed to have their daughter, and he would return her in exchange for $25,000. It was later determined that this had simply been a disgusting scam and that he actually had no involvement in their daughter's disappearance. And around a similar time, a man had come forward claiming to have hit Beverly with his car on the night of her disappearance. But this too was ultimately proven to be untrue, and I just cannot wrap my head around why someone would make up such a thing. In the year of 1980, two men named James First and Robert Shankland, who had recently retired from being police officers located in Cleveland, had stated that they received a tip in the year of 1974 that they believed at the time had been extremely important in the investigation, so much so that they believed they had found the person responsible. According to them, in 1974, they'd received a tip from an attorney in the Cleveland area who had a client who had informed them that their brother had been confessing to being the one who had abducted Beverly. This pair of detectives at the time of receiving this tip had tracked down the brother of the client of this attorney and taken him in for questioning in response to this alleged confession. According to them, the man had confirmed he lived near Halloran Park in the year of Beverly's disappearance and that he had had a past of luring young girls into his home where he would molest them. I don't believe he had named the victims that he had assaulted, or at least I couldn't find any record of whether he had done so, but he had gone on to tell the investigators that he did not specifically remember Beverly being one of the victims. He did, however, claim to have what he described as being flashes of memory, which portrayed a girl who had called herself Beverly. And the pair of detectives at the time had been adamant of his guilt and involvement in Beverly's disappearance, but the prosecutor's office at the time had refused to take it any further due to an alleged lack of evidence. I couldn't find any more information relating to whether or not this man was ever arrested and charged with anything relating to child molestation charges following his admittance of having assaulted a number of young girls, but if you do know, then please do let me know down below. In 1988, a man named William Henry Redmond was charged with the murder of an 8-year-old girl named Jane Marie Olthoff in Pennsylvania in 1951. Allegedly, he had told another inmate while he was serving his sentence in prison that he had also killed 3 other girls. And when the authorities had learned of this fact, he had then been questioned on whether he was potentially involved in Beverly's case in particular. He had refused to state whether or not conclusively he was involved, but it was known that he had been in the general area at the time of Beverly's disappearance. He also had quite a track record relating to child molestation charges, which started in 1933, but one thing that was argued by some authorities had been that based on his previous convictions, it would seem that Beverly would have been considerably older than all of his previous victims. Another false lead occurred in 1994 when someone had discovered a letter hidden underneath a piece of carpet inside a home on Midvale Avenue in Cleveland. The letter had been written in 1960 by a woman who'd stated that she'd discovered her husband attempting to dispose of a body, one that she identified as being that of Beverly POTTS. She had apparently discovered him doing so in the furnace of their home, but when the authorities had tracked this woman down and questioned her regarding this letter, she admitted that she had falsified the claim. According to her, she had simply written this letter in some sort of revenge fantasy, she described it, that she held against her husband, who had at the time been abusing her but has since passed away. And another alleged confession had occurred in letter form in the year of 2000. A reporter at the Cleveland Plain Dealer had received a number of letters over the space of about a year or two, allegedly from an elderly man claiming to have been responsible for the molestation and murder of Beverly POTTS in 1951. They stated that he wanted to confess to his crime before his death, which was apparently imminent, but the author had remained anonymous. He stated in one letter that he was planning on turning himself into the authorities on August the 24th, 2001, specifically because this would be the 50th anniversary of Beverly's disappearance. But very shortly before this date, he had addressed another letter to the same reporter stating that he would not be able to follow through on this pledge of turning himself in because he had been placed in full-time care of a nursing home. Despite authorities being made aware of these letters and a subsequent investigation being launched, they weren't ever able to establish an identity of the author, and there are mixed opinions on whether or not people think these letters are a hoax. Because of the nature of Beverly's disappearance, it has since become one of the most widely known missing persons cases, and there have been numerous books and media articles related to covering the details of her chilling case. Sadly, Beverly's parents have both since passed away, her mother in 1956 and her father in 1970, with her sister later passing away in 2006. All of them without having any answers for Beverly's disappearance. I really do hope that one day we find some answers in relation to what had happened to Beverly all those years before, as it is completely heartbreaking, and like I said at the start, it is so chilling to consider that a 10-year-old girl could go missing so close to her own home in a seemingly safe area. So that is where I'm going to end today's video. I hope you guys found this interesting. Obviously, as always, let me know your thoughts down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you guys again tomorrow for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.